Welcome to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karen Smith. Tonight, we are very privileged to have as our guest Dr. Dan Roodt from South Africa. Dan Roodt is an Afrikaner author and an intellectual who also worked for some time in the financial markets. He was born in the late 50s in Springs, a city just east of Johannesburg, where he also went to primary school. He has spent most of his adult life in Johannesburg, apart from a stint in Paris, where he learned French and became, in his own words, more Europeanized than most South Africans, although my roots are in Africa, in our wonderful sunny country, which has been so manhandled these past few decades. He holds a PhD in Afrikaans language and literature, but also comments regularly in the media and on the website praag.org. That's praag.org, on South African politics and society. In 2005, he published a popular book critical of the current South African government called The Scourge of the ANC. More recently, he has written on South Africa's English identity, as well as penning a preface to the South African edition of Jared Taylor's White Identity, Racial Consciousness in the 21st Century. Most of his books are available on praag.org. In 2015, Dr. Dan Roodt's organization, Praag, will launch a classic class action suit against the South African government for the loss of life it has overseen over the last 20 years, as well as writing more books and translating at least one book from French. Now, that in 2015, Dan Roodt's organization was going to do that. But today, there was an article published that Dan Roodt is claiming a ton of money from the South African government for Afrikaners for the loss of their language in South Africa, which we will get into later. Welcome, Dan.
Hello there, Karen.
Dan, it's very, very nice to have you back on the program. Considering your incredibly busy schedule, you've just done a whirlwind tour of the USA, spoken at the American Renaissance, met some wonderful people that you wrote an article about. And I'd love if you could just tell the audience something about that trip to America and the people that you met there. Because sadly for us, your article was written in South African language, so I couldn't share it amongst the American readers. And I'm sure they'd love to hear your impression of the people that you met there.
Well, yes, I've been to those American Renaissance conferences twice before, once in 2006 and then in 2011 as well. But the one in 2011 was the one which was more or less cancelled, but then held almost in a clandestine fashion in a hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina, after there was some left-wing threats and I think even bomb scares to a previous hotel where it was scheduled to have been held. But this year, I think it was very different. And I ascribe that to the Trump phenomenon, and all of the conservatives in the US seem to have the wind in their sails, as Jared Taylor put it during his talk at the conference. And there was an optimism in the air, and people were really excited about what was going on. And yes, there were lots of young people too. I met lots of young Americans who have discovered conservative ideas over the last few years, and they're very gung-ho, and they want to take the movement forward. So, and I think it's also being influenced by what's happening in Europe with the rise of all these patriotic parties in a lot of European countries. So there seems to be sort of a worldwide awakening or renaissance of Western and European peoples. And I think that's good for everyone. It's almost like the phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats. And that was definitely my impression at the conference. It was held at the Montgomery State Park in Tennessee, near a town called Burns. A very beautiful setting, and on the Saturday night there was also what they called an after party where some two young people sang a few southern songs to the guitar and violin, sort of a impromptu folk concert that they gave there. And it was a very amicable kind of gathering and of like-minded people from all over the world. And then there were even some Europeans there. I met people from Switzerland and even a young guy from Finland, and he's also following the situation in South Africa. So, yes, it's actually very exciting, all of this kind of cross-pollination that's going on among all of the Western countries. But I think the whole movement is still in its early days, and, depending on what happens later on this year during the US elections, it could either get a big boost from a Trump election, or it could maybe fall back a little bit. But I think we sort of passed the point of no return now. And from here onwards, things are probably going to develop quite spectacularly going forward, because most people have now become disillusioned with the whole multicultural model, with immigration and the kind of idealization and lies that they were told during the 20th century regarding the third world and, the attractiveness of these supposed exotic cultures. Whereas we, of course, in South Africa have centuries of experience of fairly exotic African cultures, and though we're not prejudiced against Africans, we respect them for what they are, but we don't want to be like them, and there are certain elements of their culture and customs and so on that we don't want to make our own. And I think that has been our attitude for quite a long time, and it seems that the rest of the world is only now really being confronted what we've been living through, in quite an intense way for the last 2 or 3 centuries.
Yeah, yes, because the rest of the world has this picture of the noble savage, and when they're confronted with the reality, it's not quite the same thing, is it?
Yes, exactly. That poem, I think I referred to it recently in a piece I wrote, which hasn't been published yet, but I wrote quite a long piece of about 5,000 words following on the 40th anniversary of the Soweto riots. And I referred to Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. And I think he talks, there's a line in the poem where he refers to this kind of ingratitude that you get from the people you are trying to help. And he calls them half child, half devil.
Wow.
And that's, it's not a very politically, that was written in 1899, so it was before the age of political correctness, but it's a very apposite formulation, half child, half devil. And in some respects, behavior in Africa, the kind of rioting that we've seen again over the last few weeks, 20 buses were burnt in Pretoria, shops were looted and that sort of thing. You also see that in the US, of course. That sort of behavior which we don't really understand, but we have to acknowledge that it exists and it's always going to be there. It seems that no amount of education or exposure to the Western way of life and thinking is ever going to change that. It may change it for some people, but there will always be, some percentage of Africans or maybe even Arabs or Muslims who will behave in a very aggressive, kind of anarchic fashion.
Yes, yes.
And that's what the world has to come to terms with. And of course, that's what is so difficult to people, especially on the left of the political spectrum, because they are actually lying to themselves. They are deluding themselves about their own possibilities or their own powers to actually change other people. There are limits.
Absolutely, Dan, because
your influence.
Those people do not want to integrate. They do not want to change. So no matter how much we might wish them to, and try and convince others and ourselves that they will integrate and become like us, they will not. They want us by one means or another, and they don't really care what means. They want us to become like them.
Yes, and we have to accept their standards of behavior and their levels of corruption. For example, in South Africa, if you open the newspapers here every day, it's all about the president's corruption and the money spent on his private so-called homestead in his area in the KwaZulu-Natal province. And now he's been told that he should pay back about $500,000 of the $15 million that they spent on his house. And he doesn't even, apparently he doesn't even have the money to pay that back, even though he's received, probably millions of dollars over the years from the state. And his family has been involved in business deals with the state. So you would think that by now they must be rolling in the money. But no, somehow it's just kind of disappeared down some rabbit hole. And all of this corruption and news about corruption we see every day in the media. And nothing ever happens. People aren't really charged about this. It's never, if there's some sort of politically incorrect phrase uttered by a white person, they will send 20 policemen to his or her house and arrest them, and they will be brought to trial fairly quickly and fined or threatened with imprisonment and so on. But when people in government commit these crimes and corruption, nothing ever seems to happen. And that's the story of Africa. And you can read any book by any academic or researcher about Africa since independence, and it's always the same story. Corruption, self-enrichment by politicians, the elite monopolizing the wealth of the country for themselves, and the rest of the population being left in a state of extreme poverty or even starvation. That's been common for the last 40 or 50 years since independence in Africa. And the most obvious recent example, of course, is Zimbabwe, where they had their revolution and they also confiscated the property of the white landowners. And over the last few weeks, news has been filtering through from Zimbabwe that there's a near famine situation there. They're already getting food aid from British NGOs like Save the Children and Oxfam and so on, but apparently they now need a huge amount more because there are 3 or 4 million people in desperate need of food. So on the whole, if you talk about Africa and including South Africa and a place like Zimbabwe, black government has not been good for Africa. It's been almost, with the exception of one or two countries that are sort of ethnically homogenous and where they have got, either because they're close to South Africa or because they've got some resources like diamonds or oil or something like that. On the whole, it has been a complete disaster. So, in retrospect now, looking back at things, whites in South Africa really do not have to feel guilty at all about trying to stave off a black takeover or an Afro-Marxist revolution, because it's been in the interest of everybody not to have that kind of government. And many, apparently, there were some reports over the last few days that, some of the blacks in Zimbabwe now freely admit that they were much better off under Ian Smith's white government in Zimbabwe than under the current black government of Robert Mugabe. So the West must, must look very carefully at our experience here before they take any steps to allow themselves to be led into a situation where there'll be a minority in their own country under a democracy.
Dan, sorry to interrupt, but democracy, then again, Mr. Zuma said that corruption is a Western paradigm, so it does not apply to him. It does not apply to him or his culture. So therefore, democracy, is that not also a Western paradigm that does not apply then to African countries? Would that not be a sensible thing to say? That democracy really is not an African concept.
I've got some old books here that are actually quite valuable if you buy them in antiquarian bookshops and so on. They were written in the 19th century by some of these missionaries that went out to convert the black tribes, but some of them were actually quite observant, and then they wrote down all the customs and value systems of the people. And something that comes out very strongly in all of these accounts, all of these ethnographic studies, is that within African culture, the highest virtue or the highest moral principle is loyalty to one's leader and to one's chief. So as the one author put it, you can be a liar, a thief, a scoundrel, a rapist, or a criminal, but as long as you are loyal to your chief, you are a good man. And I've said, that sentence has struck me when I read it, and it's been with me all along for years now. And looking at South African politics today and seeing how the media are trying to get Zuma fired for his corruption and his his dealings with his cronies and so on. They don't seem to understand that ultimately he is the leader, he's the chief of the Zulus, and no matter what he does, his people are going to be loyal to him. And in being loyal, they are being good. So it's an entirely different system to the Western system. Something like, people here were completely amazed, for example, when David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister of England after losing a referendum on this whole Brexit issue.
Yes.
Something like that will never happen here. It's completely unknown for a leader to ever resign after some sort of setback or misjudgment or anything like that. he will hold on to power as long as possible, just like Mugabe has.
Mm-hmm.
I think Mugabe has now become probably, if not the longest ruling leader in the world. He must be close to that because he's been in power now for 36 years as a president for life. And he has elections every now and again,
Yeah.
which he inevitably wins. Because if he doesn't have the support, the election will be rigged in such a way that he does get a majority. And that sort of thing has been done over and over again in Africa. So all of the European Union and the United States, the UK, who come here with all of their NGOs and their embassies, and they're distributing money and supposedly to promote democracy and so on. It's all that money is falling on fallow ground because they do not understand the culture and the mentality of the people. And as Africans migrate to the West and other peoples migrate to the West in this kind of demographic revolution that we are living through at the moment, where Westerners have very few children, and of course, people in Africa have a very high birth rate.
And being encouraged
they're going to become they're in for a huge surprise.
Well, yes, because but despite the already enormous influx of other races into South Africa, and the already huge birth rate there, Mr. Malema the other day encouraged them to have yet more babies. It's beyond understanding.
Yes, and of course they've got this absurd system where they pay child grants to young girls to have children at the age of 14 or 15 while they're still at school. In most of the black schools, there are child mothers and so on. Yes, it's completely absurd, and that stimulates the population growth even more. But in South Africa, of course, we have an enormous problem with HIV too. So, and that has kept the population in check to some extent, because within the sort of reproductive age from about 16 to 49, 1/4 of the people actually are HIV positive, and millions of them have full-blown AIDS. So, and if it weren't for the United States providing these AIDS medication and so-called antiretroviral drugs, the situation would have been much worse.
And yet, as I understand
there might have even a decline in the South African population as a result of AIDS.
But as I understand it, the state hospitals do not have those available. So even though that huge amount of aid and help and drugs and et cetera, are being sent, they just disappear.
Well, I'm not too sure about that because, I've done a little bit of, scouting on the ground and so on. And there's a huge amount of American money that's being spent in South Africa on AIDS prevention and on treatment and so on. And at all these state clinics, there is usually a building with huge letters written on it, US Aid. And if you go there, if anyone goes there, they immediately have to have an HIV test. And it takes about 10 minutes. And they test them right there and then. And about 1 in 10 then comes out HIV positive across all age groups. And then they get referred to a counselor immediately who gives them some counseling. And then they go on to the drug.
Okay.
And onto the drug program. And they've got full-time physicians there who just treat AIDS patients all the time. So how many of them actually then afterwards disappear or maybe not come back? I don't know about that.
Yes.
But at least the ones, anyone, even if you go to a state clinic or hospital with flu or a cold or ingrown toenails or whatever, they are going to give you an HIV test right there on the spot. And these tests are provided probably by multinational pharmaceuticals in the US, most probably. And it's very efficient. It takes 10 minutes, and then that person will know if he or she is HIV positive or not.
Yes, yes. Wow. I had not understood that because what I have read is that the drugs are not available in the state hospitals. But also I read a report recently that 88% of the police force is HIV positive.
I don't know. I think I'm not too sure about the police force, but I know that of the so-called soldiers in the army, a very high percentage of them is also HIV positive from the time when they spent, when they were lounging about in Tanzania before the ANC takeover. But it's quite positive. I don't know, 88% sounds
Huge.
really high.
It does. I wondered about that.
But it wouldn't surprise me if the police were even higher than the average rate of, say, between 10 and 25%, depending on one's age or sex.
Yes.
Because regarding the AIDS, I think they refer to the 3 M's, moving men with money.
Uh-huh.
Now, any policeman, he's got a state vehicle, so he's moving, he earns a salary from the state, so he's got money, and he's a man. So he will have access to a number of so-called partners, and of course that facilitates the spread of the virus. And the situation, in some of these black townships is just horrendous. I mean, people get killed there and murdered, and some of these cases don't even make it into the courts. And there are and the other thing that's happening at the moment is lots and lots of riots. During the days of white government in South Africa, if there were any kind of a riot somewhere, then hordes of foreign journalists from the BBC and the American networks and the New York Times and the London Guardian and the French Le Monde, so on, they would be all over the place taking footage or shooting photographs and so on. And the next day that would be front page news all over the world. And maybe it was just one little riot.
Yes.
Somewhere. But
yes.
Now, on average, I mentioned that in one of my recent articles too, we have 15 protests per day, of which 50%, and these are the police figures, 50% turn into a riot or some form of public violence. So we've got about 7 riots per day in South Africa at the moment. And none of the foreign newspapers or media are covering this. Here and there it gets mentioned, and in the local news we hear it on the radio, avoid such and such a road because there's a riot going on, stone throwing, stoning vehicles, looting shops, burning vehicles, and so on. But it's almost normal. And, that's the way it goes at the moment.
But Dan, I think that South Africans have become desensitized to these things as well, because it has become such a part of one's life. Before you,
yes, it's almost like living in a war zone.
Yes.
There are sort of. I imagine during the Second World War, people in Europe got used to hearing bombs falling, and a few buildings get flattened every now and again. So yes, as you say, you get. One becomes inured to that, you get used to it. And now, we are used to it. If you hear about something over the radio, just avoid that road or that area for the day. and you don't think twice about it. Just people continue with their daily lives, and they just accept this as part of life.
But it
And
isn't.
unfortunately, if in the Western countries they continue along the present road, that is where they will end up eventually. Except that I think we still benefit from a strict order somewhere in the world. We still drive German cars and Japanese cars. And there are factories here producing those cars that are controlled by Germans or Japanese. And they maintain that order that we still benefit from. But when everything worldwide breaks down, I would almost call it kind of a zombie apocalypse, or this kind of third world apocalypse, then there won't be any pockets of order left anywhere in the world, and not even in the major metropolitan centers in the West. And then I think then we sort of end up in a kind of science fiction decline of civilization and a new barbarism. So we've got some really hard thinking to do about the course that we have to take in the near future.
But Dan, the people have done the hard thinking, and the people all over the world have made their will pretty clear. They do not want this influx of so-called refugees into their countries. But the elites have sold us out because they will not listen to the will of the people.
Oh, yes. This recurrent theme of being sold out by the elites, I think it's been like that now since more or less the Second World War. In the 1950s, it already started in all the British colonies. And even though de Gaulle is today revered as a great French leader and so on, still, he did also sell out the French Algerians and his own army in Algeria, who was fighting the war against the rebels in Algeria, and eventually 1 million people, 1 million Frenchmen who'd never set foot on French soil, the French colonists there, they had to leave the country within 1 month. So, and that was the start of it, and it's happened afterwards again and again. Mrs. Merkel, also through her throwing open, with her open border policy towards the Middle East, she's plunged Germany into a major crisis. It's going to be very difficult to stop this influx of immigrants, of Muslim immigrants into Germany now, because there's now a stream of them just coming in. And it's going to cost them, I think up to 100 billion euros over the next 4 or 5 years to supposedly manage that, the ones who are already there. That's another great example of elite betrayal of the people of Germany. And we had the situation here where, our leaders were supposedly going to negotiate with these radical movements who were at the time classified as terrorist groups by most of the Western countries, including the USA, including all the law enforcement agencies in the USA, FBI, CIA, Homeland Security, and so on. And the next moment, they sort of just handed over power to them on a plate, including the army and the police force, etc., etc. So, and now we are coping with the aftermath. 20 years later, we're still trying to adjust and trying to cope with what they did 20 years ago. So that is, people have to be very suspicious of the ruling elites in the West and especially the kind of Washington elite
Oh,
in the USA too, whether they're from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, they do not have the interests of the people at heart. They're looking after their own careers and their own pensions and their own, even their own egos. If they can get a Nobel Prize or something like that, they would sell millions of people down the river for a brief moment of glory. That's what we've gone through here. So, in that respect, there are high hopes being placed on Mr. Trump to turn this whole thing around. He was seen as an outsider, and hopefully he won't betray his supporters once he comes to power.
yes, is that not the scary thing, though, Dan? Because recently, in the last elections, we handed the Republican Party, we handed them Washington, we handed them the Senate, we handed them the entire Congress. And immediately that they got there, they turned their backs on the people. They turned their backs on their election promises. They have done nothing to change anything in Washington. And nothing to stop the influx of Muslims here, nothing to stop the freeing of the Gitmo people, etc. So they will promise anything whilst on that campaign trail. And the minute they hit DC, everything is forgotten. It is so frightening how fast they turn their backs on the people who voted for them.
Yes, you're right. And I think ultimately this whole political system will have to be, re-looked at. In ancient Greece, everybody had a turn at government, and it was part of your civic duty to be involved to some extent in government. And I think people will have to take a lot more interest in what's going on and get involved and be part of some group and try and influence what's going on and not trust these elected officials who they kind of smile at you once in a while every 4 or 5 years during an election, and the rest of the time they are left up to their own devices, and they pass all these laws and they horse trade amongst themselves. And eventually, you end up in a situation where you don't want to be.
Well,
so we have to fight this apathy amongst the citizenry.
Yes.
We've also got that problem here, despite all of our, despite the crisis that's developed here. You still have people just interested in watching rugby or football or tennis in front of their TV. And, as long as the road to work is not actually blocked, it can even be blocked for a day or two, but as long as it's not permanently blocked with stones or burning cars, they will just drive past it and forget about it. And, as long as they can earn their salary and at the end of the month and pay off their cars and their homes, they seem to be oblivious to the rest. And that sort of mentality we've got to try and change. And unfortunately, over here, people who do not take cognizance of what's going on and do not take precautions, especially regarding crime and violence and so on, they eventually end up getting killed. So it can be, this kind of apathy can be lethal in the end. Well, it's going to destroy you, literally.
Well, absolutely, Dan, because you're seeing that in Europe at the moment as well. And not only in Europe, in Idaho the other day, a 5-year-old girl was raped to death by Muslim immigrants. And so it's happening all over the world what South Africa has been going through for about half a century, because leading up to the end of apartheid, plus the quarter century since the end of apartheid, we've been living through this. So what we've been living through for a very, very long time, the rest of the world is now starting to experience. And the problem still seems to be the fact that the media will always take the side of the violent person rather than the victim.
Yes.
For some reason, the victimized person seems to always be the one to blame. They are the ones who did something wrong.
Yes, they provoked him, or something of that order. Yes. Well, I feel especially sorry for the Europeans because, ever since the Second World War, they've gone through all this pacifism and they don't have weapons. They're not allowed to own guns. And even though this black government has been trying to take away our guns and they've made it fairly difficult to get permits and so on to own guns, from what I hear, people still buy a lot of guns and a lot of people are still armed. So, we at a certain level, we will defend ourselves against being attacked. But I think the same holds for the US. The US has also got a very strong gun culture. Yeah. And there's the Second Amendment and so on. But the Europeans, they are really like lambs to the slaughter, because they're not used to defending themselves, and they are now being attacked very aggressively. And unless they just happen to have a policeman nearby or something like that, they're going to come to a sticky end. But as you say, the media are our main problem because they support gun control, and they're always taking the side of the perpetrator. He was the victim. He is the victim of his circumstances and of his socioeconomic status and of his race and so on. And so they blame the victims. And in this country, it's quite strange because even in the sort of liberal mainstream Afrikaans media, they still report on a lot of these murders and home invasions and so on. Whereas in the English media, most of the time, it's completely ignored because I think they're more under foreign influence and sort of British influence.
Yeah.
So there, they don't even report on this stuff. So you can live in this kind of fantasy world, and where all the major news is just about racism and
on the part of whites.
It's all anti-white, and it's all the whites are to blame for everything. And if you believe that kind of narrative, then you are really lost. And the next moment you'll just be invaded or killed or hijacked in your car, and you won't even know what's happened.
Well, Dan, for me, it's like this. If in South Africa you are lucky enough to have a job as a white person, you are so busy keeping that job and doing the work of for people, because the people either below or above you have been appointed on skin color rather than on ability. So you as a white person are carrying those not so skilled people. So you are so busy trying to hold on to your job, your home, your car, your good school for your kids. You're tired when you get home. You watch an hour of the news.
Yes, it is exhausting, definitely. I mean, everybody is just so busy trying to survive. And you've got to cope with all of that professionally, and then you've got to cope with security, all the security issues. Especially people living in places where they haven't got good security. I mean, they there are sort of attempts to burgle them just about every week or so on average.
Yes.
So, and you've got to spend a lot of money on security and electric fences and all sorts of gadgets and sensors and stuff like that. So it's a never-ending process. You're under siege, really, literally. I mean, all of us are under siege. Some of us are slightly better off than others, but everybody at some level is under siege. The barbarians are at the gate, and you've got to try and survive. That's how it is.
And so then, Dan, you come home now from this exhausting day of work, hoping that your house is still standing, okay, and having checked that the route home is safe to go, etc., etc., etc. And you get home.
Well, they literally have, sort of videos and stuff where they warn people that when you drive to your house and you see anybody in the street, you should just drive past it. Or if there's a car behind you, you shouldn't stop at your home because you should drive past it and go to the nearest police station or
good luck with
a place where there
well.
are people in case somebody is following you to hijack your car, or in case the people in the street are going to hijack your car right in front of your house as the gate is open. Yeah, that's a sort of standard advice given to people on approaching their homes. And I mean, I recently spoke to a few relatives who live in a very wealthy area in Johannesburg, and then they've got a whole private security set up there, and you can even dial the security as you approach your home, and then they can come and escort you to your gate and make sure you get inside safely, gates open, all the electric fences are on, cameras and so on. But people get lazy, and they don't call the security. They're just going home now, so they get lazy and they get a little bit too relaxed about it. Yeah, and that's when they become vulnerable. Then they do get hijacked or they do get shot up, and that's the way it goes. It's like a war almost. You've got to fight. It's like fighting a war, and you don't have a moment's relaxation. You've got to be prepared all the time, and you've got to be alert all the time.
Aware of everything that's going on around you. It is actually very, very frightening. From my own experience after being in the States now for 5 years, I'm losing a little bit of that, but once it's inculcated in you to be aware of everything, to keep your doors locked, to not drive with your windows open, etc., you don't lose that, Dan, no matter how safe you feel. You don't lose
Yes, well, when I travel overseas, even at the airport in Germany or wherever, I still watch my stuff all the time.
It's amazing, isn't it? It is the most amazing thing.
It's kind of a habit that you don't break. It's, you're aware that
you're in danger.
Yeah.
I know.
They want your stuff, and they're going to take it if you don't watch it.
I watch people here. They leave their handbag in their shopping trolley and wander off. And I look at this in total dismay, because in South Africa that would not be 1 second, not 1 second, and it would be gone. I just, there are things still in this country, no matter how bad Americans might feel it is, there are still things here that we in South Africa are wide-eyed in amazement at, I look at my home and I don't even have a fence.
Yes, that's amazing. You visit the US and you see all these homes and houses, and they haven't even got fences. Now, I mean, a place like that would not survive 24 hours in South Africa. They would just clean it out. They would just clean it out within 24 hours.
Absolutely, Dan, and they park their cars on the street. It's South Africa. You'll go a car on the street overnight.
Yeah, they'll strip it right there and then. When you get back, you'll just find the empty shell without the wheels or the seats or anything. I mean, and most of the body would have been stripped away as well to be in
Absolutely.
chop shops and sold.
Absolutely. But now you compare those two things, and then you understand why people outside of South Africa cannot even begin to wrap their heads around what is happening there. The few people who do know, they are disbelieving because they've got nothing to compare it with. They have no life history
Well,
that
you know,
teaches them that.
I mean, I've read a lot about places like Detroit
Yes,
and
yes.
what St. Louis and East St. Louis. Some of those areas are pretty bad too, or maybe the south side of Chicago. You know, they've got gunfights there and killings and gang warfare. I think that approaches what South Africa is like, but it's just that here it's almost all over.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not just localized in certain areas. You know, the whole of the place is, even in the well-to-do areas like when these relatives of mine live, where they've got their own private security and all that, even there they are under threat. So nobody's safe anywhere. You've got to be alert all the time, and you're taking risks. Just going about your normal business. You are definitely taking risks, and we read it every day in the newspaper. You know, so and so was shot yesterday, robbed at gunpoint.
And Dan, you read it, you close the newspaper, and you go about your life as if it had not happened. Most people, because it is a part of your daily life. You would be stunned to not find somebody murdered in the morning.
Yes, and you know, I think you know, some of these newspapers they make a living out of putting these things on the front page, and if it started not happening, yeah, possibly no one would want to buy the newspaper. There wouldn't be any real news in it, because people move to Australia and places like that from here, and then they tell me that for a whole week or months go by and there's not even a single murder being reported. No. And somehow it seems to them that nothing ever happens in Australia because you don't have these sort of life and death situations being recounted every day in breathless detail in your daily newspaper.
Yep. So, you know, but that's how I kind of feel, Dan, is that we, the whites of South Africa, have done a very, very bad public relations story. We have not pressed hard to make the world aware of the facts of our history, the facts of apartheid, the facts of what is happening in South Africa today. We have allowed the story to be taken over by the other side, and we have not presented our side.
Yes, you're quite right. I mean, they always talk about controlling the narrative, and we don't control the narrative. That's for sure. I mean, they do, and even today, I mean, you read these stories in international publications about what happened 20 or 30 years ago, or some, you know, on the 16th of June. 1976, this black child, Hector Peterson, got shot, not by a white policeman, but by a black policeman, or it might even have been by one of the rioters, but the whites are blamed for that. And that will be reported on 30 years after the fact, but none of what's going on at the moment and all the atrocities taking place, all the black and white atrocities, none of that would get reported overseas in the international media. So they control the narrative, and that's what we have to change. But fortunately, now with the internet, things are starting to change. And you've got Facebook and Twitter and so on, and websites. And I think your more informed reader from overseas, they start seeing the reality for what it is. But it's a long and a difficult process because you're fighting against these very powerful international liberal left-wing media groups, and they control it, and they only publish the news that they deem fit for people to read.
That goes with their narrative.
It's only the one side of the story, and it's usually sort of a very one-sided. Yeah, it's a very skewed and unfair side of the story at that.
We're coming up to an ad break. We will be back in a few minutes. Welcome back to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karen Smith, and our guest tonight is Dr. Dan Roodt from South Africa. Before the break, we were talking about how the international media, mostly controlled by the leftists, control the narrative. And that is half of the reason why the real story of South Africa is not public. Welcome back, Dan.
Hello, Karen. Nice to be back.
Dan, we were talking about how the media control the narrative, and how you seem to feel that with the advent of the internet, more people are learning the truth. But it requires people to want to know the truth, doesn't it?
Yes, that's true. You've got to have an interest in getting to the nitty-gritty of the whole story. But it's interesting the way, these conflicts and flame wars and whatever on the internet take place. And I think there was an article recently written by some left-wing commentator where they were saying that, the so-called alt-right trolls constitute a real danger for this master narrative that they've constructed over the last few decades, and that they were more effective than the traditional conservatives, because these kind of alt-right people, and they're very active on social media and so on, that they would actually go out and troll other more mainstream conservatives and the liberals and so on, and it causes this kind of these fights, and that creates interest, and people take sides, and now there's a full-scale kind of info war going on, to use the name of Alex Jones's website and program.
Yes.
We're right in the middle of the info war now, and we in South Africa have to be, we've got to really do a lot more to make sure that we get the message out, and that people in the rest of the world start learning about us and our experience and our recent history that could be very instructive for people elsewhere in the world.
Yes, because it said if you don't know your history, it will just keep on repeating itself. So you need to know history, otherwise you're going to make the same mistakes. But how do we do that, Dan? Because we are not only fighting 50 years at least of misinformation being fed to the world about South Africa. So we are fighting the outside world's opinion that this is karma and we deserve it because of apartheid. That is one of the things we are fighting. But we are also fighting the ignorance of our own people in South Africa, who either do not know or do not want to know what is going on in their own backyard.
Yes, although I find that, on the social media and especially Facebook, a lot of people here are on Facebook. I think I now know only a handful of people who don't have a Facebook account, and therefore all of them do communicate on Facebook, and there are all sorts of groups, and some of them have 40 or 50,000
Yes.
people
Yes.
on members, and they exchange views there and information and so on. So there's a sort of a socialization process going on there. And I really think that, and something else that's happened here is that, coming back to this notion that there's a sort of an ideological conflict going on the internet, and you had that especially on the commentary sections of the newspapers and the major news websites in South Africa.
Yeah.
And at one point, the media decided to close down the commentary sections because they were getting out of control. And what happened was that they were actually losing the battle. And they wanted to, they were losing control, and they were, and the people from outside, the ordinary people writing on these commentary sections, their views were actually becoming the dominant ones, not the ones from the liberal journalists who are carefully vetted and selected from the universities and inculcated with all this politically correct, multicultural, anti-white ideology. The kind of citizens writing there, they were winning the battle. So then they closed down the commentary section. So they imposed a kind of a censorship there.
Yes.
But that has now moved to Facebook, I think, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. And there's a socialization process going on. And I think people do feel solidarity with one another, and they now have a shared experience and a shared view that there is a major problem. The only thing that's lacking now is that there's a lack of people feel there's a lack of leadership because they've been abandoned by their leaders, and they feel a little bit lost. They feel they haven't really got a plan, and they're overwhelmed by the whole numbers issue. They feel completely outnumbered, and therefore they feel powerless. There's a sense of powerlessness and lack of leadership. So that's why I feel we've now got to come up with some spectacular counter moves that will make a big splash in the media. And we've got to do some, we could do some really controversial court cases. We're planning some of that, and maybe a few protests here and there. And otherwise just keep putting out information and articles and views out there that will stir things up. So the process is going on. It's
in place.
It's in place. Yes, I mean there is a process going on, and South Africa cannot continue like this forever. In some of the other African countries, I mean, for decades they can just kind of muddle along like that and get some Western aid and sort of scrape along the bottom of near starvation and poverty and so on. But with South Africa being a more developed country, it cannot do that. Either it's going to collapse completely like Zimbabwe, or there will be some form of a denouement, or we will come to some sort of a point where there's going to be a fight or a change or a revolution or a counter-revolution, and that point might not be too far off. When you're in this process and you can't really predict the future, so you never know when it'll happen. It could happen in 2 weeks' time. It could be in 20 years' time. But sooner or later, we'll come to that point where there will have to be a change. And we've got to prepare for that, and we've got to actually push the process along and try and keep it going and not kind of lapse into this sort of apathy and gradual decline so that we'll end up just like any other African country that will survive off Western aid and just kind of papering over the cracks and the problems for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got places like Malawi and Zambia and so on. I mean, in a place like Malawi, they kicked out all the Indians in the 70s. That was their one major move there. And since then, the country has been mired in poverty, and it's survived from Western aid and so on. And a lot of the Malawians are trickling down to South Africa, and they're now working here and there and sending money back home. But we won't go that route. Things are too tense here, too. And also, the rest of the world have invested too much in South Africa. Not so much capital, although there's a fair amount of that, too. I mean, the German and the Japanese car companies have got a lot of factories here and other multinationals. But maybe the money at stake is not that big in global terms, but ideologically, they've invested a lot here in saying, you've got to now accept our model, and it's going to work there, and we're going to make it work. I mean, the European Union and the US, they're pumping a lot of money into left-wing think tanks, social workers, even people, these AIDS people. You're talking about the whole, I mean, we referred to the whole AIDS thing earlier on.
Yes.
At one time, I used to spend quite a lot of time in a cafe waiting for my kids when they were in their final year of school. And there were people from an NGO also visiting this cafe quite regularly. And then I got talking to them. And there's a whole... Think about this. There's a whole NGO funded from overseas just dealing with the prostitutes in one inner city area in Johannesburg. They've got a whole staff there of people just distributing stuff and condoms and drugs and HIV tests and all that, just to one area in Johannesburg, to the prostitutes there. So, and that's all coming from overseas. So they've got so much invested here. They're trying so hard to make this system work, and it's not working. I mean, they can spend billions of dollars more on it, and it won't work.
No.
So at some other point, we're going to come to that moment of truth, and then there will be a change, and it's going to have a knock-on effect on the rest of the world too, because then people will realize, well, if it can't work in South Africa, it might not work anywhere else either. So we'll have to go back to the drawing board. So depending on how spectacular the eventual blow-up will be, whether it's going to be civil war or a counter-revolution or a economic and social collapse, famine, rioting. I mean, we've already got a lot of rioting. So, 15 at least 7 or 10 riots every day. But maybe if it escalates to 100 riots every day, maybe if half the schools or all of the schools get burned down. Earlier this year, they burned 25 schools in the north of the country. But maybe if 2,000 schools get burned down within a few weeks, maybe then at some other point, it's going to have a shock effect.
Yeah.
Here and overseas. And we're sort of building up to that. I mean, the tension is you can feel the tension rising all the time. That's for sure. Things are not just kind of chugging along at the moment. There's huge tension. There's also tension, within the ruling party. People are killing each other.
Yes, I
the
saw
politicians
that.
in the ruling party are killing each other for positions because black politicians can only make money out of politics. They don't have other qualifications. I mean, for a start, they probably don't have much by way of qualifications anyway. But they can only do politics. They can do nothing else. They can't go back to accounting or fixing cars or anything like that. They can only do politics. So if they don't get in, if they don't if they're not on the list, if they're not on the ticket to get a political job, they're nowhere. So it's a choice between either you driving around in a black Mercedes Benz and getting $100,000 a year as a politician or even just a municipal councillor, or you're going to go back to your shack and live in poverty and starve. So they are prepared to kill one another for those positions. And that's what's happening in some parts of the country now, is there are political assassinations between the members of the ruling party. And then you've got the breakaway faction, the Malema EFF's faction that broke away from the ANC. They are also involved, they are also competing with them in these elections. We're going to have municipal elections now in August. So, and there's a lot of tension between those two factions too. They hate each other and they vilify each other all the time. So there could even be an outbreak of violence between those two black political movements.
Which Malema has threatened, Dan. Malema has threatened that. He said they will take Zuma out by the barrel of a gun if necessary. And he stated that on international radio. So he's not scared to even stand up and say an absolutely treasonous statement like that. And he's done it more than once, and he says he's serious about it.
Oh, yes. He's very radical. And if you go to their website, I mean, they are openly Marxist, Leninist, and they talk about nationalizing the entire economy, nationalizing the land. They want a sort of a 1917 style Russian revolution in South Africa. That's what they are gunning for. So if ever they should get the majority vote here, then it's going to be chaos, for sure. I mean, I've even thought about writing a kind of a satirical novel or something about the 100 days of Julius Malema, because I think it won't last longer than 100 days. But in those 100 days, we're going to have a rough ride. It's going to be chaos if ever they should take power. But what's happening, the other kind of more liberal political party, the DA, that used to be a sort of a white-oriented party, but it's moved further and further to the left, and it's now also become a black party. They are also trying to take a few big cities from the ANC. And of course, they are in control of the Western Cape, where the blacks are in a minority. They're also part of the game now. So you've got these three players, and they're fighting amongst themselves for power. And sooner or later, there will be, I'm sort of stuck on almost on a French word now, what they call dérapage. There will be... things will get ugly, to put it that way. Yeah,
pretty much. A shootout at OK Corral, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
I see that happening, because I read an article today that the DA is now willing to discuss joining with the EFF. Now, were that to happen, their chances of not only becoming the chief opposition, but possibly winning are doubled, because Malema has an enormous following of disaffected black unemployed youth. And you add that now to the DA's more supposedly left-wing, which not really, not anymore, but supposedly, you're going to have a powerhouse party there if those two did merge.
Yes, it's going to be kind of an unholy alliance, because the DA presents itself as a more of a liberal to almost mainstream conservative in the South African context party, and they're going to align themselves with this Marxist Leninist militia. I mean, the Malema's party is not really a political party. They are like an African militia. They are like a rebel group. They don't really parade around with guns, but they are in uniform and they wear berets.
Yes.
And they've got military style sort of positions. They call themselves commander.
Yes.
And things like that. And they've got this very kind of bellicose discourse and terminology that they use all the time. And it's not politics. It's not about winning an election. It's about revolution, taking control, defeating the enemy and the struggle.
Yes.
Those are the sorts of terms that they use. You can go and have a look on their website. Very interesting to read all of that. So the Marxist Leninist militia group, they're going to be in alliance with a party that's supported by some white business people.
Yes.
So imagine that. Imagine that. And imagine if they win. Well, what a fiasco could arise out of that. Because I don't think they will be ruling for 30 days before there are going to be huge contradictions in the whole thing. And it's probably also going to fall apart. So, and even these municipal elections might, normally the municipal elections in South Africa are not that important and not much changes anyway, because the municipalities are all in a big shambles. But yeah, even the ANC just losing control over one or two big municipalities might lead to some riots or, deterioration of conditions.
But Dan, I've also read, not being in South Africa myself, I don't know, but I've also read that a lot of big money is leaving the country for fear of these upcoming elections.
Yes, that's true. You're probably right. I mean, the rand has taken a hit, but it has been taking a hit for so long now that they sort of them push it to ridiculous levels, and then I was telling my wife maybe a week ago, as I said, well, watch now. Our exports are going to jump, because, I mean, the rand is just fallen out of it. It's fallen out of bed.
Yeah. And
it's scraping the bottom and so on. So obviously, South Africa now is such a bargain for foreign tourists and people going to Cape Town and even just sending stuff, all sorts of stuff from here. And lo and behold, the economists were predicting about 3-4 billion rand worth of trade surplus over the last month, and it shot up to 18. So it was about 4 times more. So, that sort of thing corrects itself a little bit because, and I think all the capital, I mean, South Africa has been exporting capital for decades now. I mean, there are billions and billions of dollars sitting in Swiss bank accounts coming from South Africa, and it's all there already. So no matter how bad it gets now, probably there won't be that much leaving because it's already gone. I mean, the people need a certain amount of money here just to keep things going, and they've already. We've already, all the rich people have already got their Swiss bank accounts. So the people who are left here, they're really stuck here, and they don't even have money many of them don't even have enough money for a plane ticket.
Yeah.
So let alone to kind of go along to the offices of Credit Suisse or UBS and tell them, oh, I've got a spare $1 million. Can you invest it for me?
Yeah, they don't.
No, those people, their money has already left.
Okay, so Dan, from there, what I would like to talk about is the poverty in South Africa. Because this whole democracy has really only enriched a top level of elite people and some corporations, okay, I admit that. But the people in general, black, white, Chinese, colored, it doesn't matter what color they are or what race they are. The people themselves have gotten dramatically poorer. The levels of poverty are just about insane in that country right now, and yet we still have the illusion from the rest of Africa that South Africa is this mecca that is drawing millions of blacks from all over the rest of poverty-stricken Africa. So you not only have the existing poverty, the existing squatter camps, black and white, you now have millions more flocking in from all over Africa, creating an even bigger problem. Where do you see any of that going? Because there is not enough business growth to deal with it.
Yes, sure. They say that apparently in Zimbabwe at the moment under Mugabe's rule, the unemployment rate is something like 80 to 90%. It's only really just the party members and a few cronies and maybe a few of the remaining white people who have got jobs. And the rest are all out of work and they are just surviving.
Yes.
Now, South Africa isn't there yet, but youth unemployment is huge. It's probably about 50 or 60%. And depending on what measure you use, unemployment is probably 30 to 40%.
Yep.
So, a lot of people are living in shacks, and you've got all these squatter camps springing up around the cities. And very many whites are getting poor as well because they're being pushed out of the system with all these affirmative action laws. And of course, what's also driving poverty is this all the labor laws and the fact that they've all these left-wing people and communists for a long time now have been pushing for trade union monopolies in certain sectors. And in some of the categories of unskilled labor, people are now earning, say, $1,000 a month, which in South Africa is quite a lot of money. Whereas, say, a school teacher would only earn half of that.
Yes.
Starting out in his or her career. So you've got people with degrees who are earning a pittance, but you've got these unskilled laborers who happen to be in certain sectors and belong to powerful trade unions, and they are earning a lot of money. So the whole labor market is skewed as a result of all these leftist laws, and that creates a lot of joblessness and poverty and so on. So how do we solve that? Only if there's a change of government will it ever be solved, and only when the labor market is loosened up and wages are allowed to fall to a level where people feel comfortable about employing people again.
Yeah.
That's a huge problem, and they're not going to solve it. They're now talking about, and they're just introducing more and more socialist measures. Now there's a thing about having some sort of a youth grant or a youth welfare system where they will get money for not doing anything. They will just get a monthly payment from the government while they're unemployed, which is crazy because then even some of the people who are now sort of doing a bit of menial labor here and there and odd jobs, they will stop working in order to get this free ride or free lunch from the state. So it's going to even worsen things.
But Dan, do people, and I really don't say this with much respect, do people really believe that there is such a thing as a free ride or a free lunch? Because there are not enough people employed to pay the already overwhelming amounts of social benefits that the state pays out in South Africa. So now we're going to make this even bigger. Where is the money going to come from?
Yeah, the amazing thing is that, and that even that surprises me all the time, is that if you look at our state finances, they actually look better than those of a lot of European countries. I think mainly because a certain portion of the private sector is still very productive and well organized, and they pay a lot of taxes to the state, and their employees get taxed. And we've got, we were voted, I think, the number one country in the world for financial reporting from listed companies. We were voted higher than the UK, US, Germany, you name it. Because we've got such good accountants. And those accountants, they actually collect the money, the taxes for the state from all of these companies and people earning, fairly high salaries and so on. And all of that money flows to the ANC, and they've got a budget of R1 trillion per annum, which used to be about $100 billion. It's now less than that.
Yeah.
And they are free to spend it as they wish. And they're just going to dole it out to their supporters or spend it on themselves or have business deals amongst themselves with the state and so on and spread it around. Yeah, and here in Johannesburg, you'll be amazed to see what kind of cars these people drive. People working for the government and municipalities and so on, driving big Mercs and Porsches and Ferraris and Bentleys and, shopping in these European brand name shops, paying $1,000 or $1,500 for a pair of shoes and all that sort of stuff. So amid all of this poverty and hardship, you've got a certain, the elite living off this tax money, and they are having, they're living like the aristocracy in the days of the Versailles court in France. They are really enjoying themselves. So as long as the private sector keeps going and paying taxes to the state, the system will continue. It won't just come to an abrupt halt anytime soon. And the state won't really run out of money unless they completely overshoot. But somehow they've sort of understood that in a crude fashion, that they shouldn't overshoot on the spending, because then they will effectively just hand over control back to the whites again, either the whites here or overseas in the form of the IMF or the World Bank or some international agency that will have to bail them out.
Yeah.
So they're very scared of that happening, and so they kind of keep the spending high, but it's not completely over the top. And of course, they're not spending it on the right things. I mean, they're not maintaining anything. They're not maintaining the infrastructure. It's all just salaries and entertainment, travel, staying in 5-star hotels. There are all these scandals all the time. You really get tired reading about these things. I mean, there's one black woman in government, a minister or something, and she was staying in a luxury hotel down at the coast for 6 months, paying something like $1,000 a day, in this hotel.
Wow. But it can't last. No, Dan, no matter how much money you might have coming in, there is so much corruption. And so much
yes, that's
fraud.
true. I mean, eventually, I think the greed will just overwhelm the system. You're right. At a certain point, it will, because then there will just be overspending, especially at the municipal level. That's already happening, because a lot of these municipalities are completely bankrupt. They've just spent everything that there is. So that, and some of them have to then be bailed out by the central government because they've just completely exhausted all of their financial resources. And they're even talking now about paying, I think, paying people $100,000 a year if for any sort of municipal political job, political position.
Yes.
Even in the tiniest little
I
one
read
horse
that this
down,
morning.
they will be earning that.
Yeah.
You know, they're talking about that now. I don't know where the money's going to come from for that, but they are talking about that because apparently, you know, obviously in Johannesburg, they earn a huge amount of money for being a municipal councillor or serving on the municipality, but in some one horse town somewhere, they don't. So they probably think, no, that's not fair. Everybody's got to be at the same level.
Yes.
That's sort of the African way, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
but I think from our perspective, from what whites have to do, we really have to do a lot more to integrate ourselves into the Western system, the trading and to trade with overseas and export a lot and try and get small businesses going and sell our services abroad and also create jobs for ourselves here in South Africa in order to make sure that we survive. And there are a lot of exciting things going on and little projects and so on. And even regarding the poverty among white people, I think that could also be addressed by setting aside pieces of land for people to build houses and to build schools for children and start caring for them and so on. There's a lot of that stuff going on. We need funds all the time. I mean, because people are short of funds. But I think those problems can be solved over the next few years. And that'll place us in a very strong position because if we can just survive this current phase, then whatever happens afterwards, we'll be in a strong position because we'll be organized and we'll be, we'll have a little bit of money and capital and we'll have thriving businesses. And we'll be earning dollars and euros from our overseas trading and so on. So even if the rand collapses, then it won't bother us too much. So we've got to get ourselves into that position as well, economically, before we even look at it, finding a political solution to what's going on in the country.
So are you thinking then that this self-determination is a good way to go? Do you think it would work? I know that the Afrikaner can make it work. And I know that the white ingenuity can make it work. There's no question in my mind about that. But do you think that is the way to go and that the ANC at any stage will with honesty come to the table and discuss it?
I don't really think so. Ultimately, I'm more inclined to think that, there's going to be some sort of a crisis somewhere along the line. It could be sooner, it could be later, but there will be a crisis, and that then will force the change. And either then the country will be partitioned, or and then we'll get a state of our own, and maybe some of the black tribes will get other states, or their own, or there will be one big black state, or something to that effect. But via negotiations, I mean, people have been trying to get those sorts of negotiations going, but there's a sort of typically African inertia about all of these things. I mean, they'll take another 20 years just to talk about talks or, parrying about self-determination and international conventions. And there'll be a meeting, and then 2 years later, another letter will get written. That's going nowhere. And also the attempts to create enclaves, like Orania and
Yes.
places like that,
Yes.
they've only had limited success in the sense that you are then, you're stepping outside of the normal markets, and you're sort of putting yourselves in a corner of the country, which is where you've got huge transport costs and there's no immediate market around you. Unless you can tap into an overseas market from there, you're not in a good position. And therefore, I mean, it's very difficult to get people out of the cities and out of the major industrialized areas. And in South Africa, really, there are about 2 or 3 of those. It is basically what they call now the Gauteng area, Johannesburg and Pretoria, and then the Western Cape, and then the Durban Pinetown area at the coast. I mean, those are the 3 really economically active and industrialized areas of South Africa, where all the employment opportunities and all the trading opportunities are. And, despite all of what's going on in South Africa, you look at some of the stats and you were simply amazed in the sense that regarding retail, South Africa is now about number 7 in the world for retail space. I mean, we've got something like 22 million square meters, which must be in the hundreds of millions of square feet of retail space. And then they're building 2 million more.
Yes.
We've got more shopping centers than Australia or Germany or probably even Canada. There are just all these shops and Chinese goods being sold there, and retail groups and cafes and so on. And so this is sort of a perverse way in which the system keeps going too. And that's all in these urban areas. So if you're not part of that, then you starve. So it's very difficult to step out of the system. And therefore, I'm more inclined to think that we should form these sort of enclaves for ourselves close to the major urban centers.
Yes.
So that at least we don't cut ourselves off from the mainstream economy. And I think that's been the lesson so far. And I suspect that people who are, want to start in Israel somewhere, in some corner of South Africa.
Yeah.
They are more banking on a kind of an apocalypse scenario, that there's going to be a civil war at some point, and then there will be refugees arriving, and people would have to start anew, sort of from scratch.
Uh-huh.
But somehow, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not going to happen, but the outside world will try and avoid that, because it's going to be a big embarrassment for them if there's a sort of an apocalyptic civil war or a race war in South Africa. And probably also these black political groups would try to avoid that too, because they know in a real war they will lose against the whites. I mean, we have never lost any sort of conventional battle against them in history, going back hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So if it had to come to outright confrontation, then we would stand a good chance. And I think they know that too, and they would try to avoid that. So that's why they will try to keep this current system, which suits them, going for as long as possible. Whereas we, on the other hand, we've got to try and push it into some sort of crisis where there will be negotiations, or there will be a breaking point where we could then start making demands and come up with another system that's more suitable. And the old system in South Africa was really not that bad. I mean, in retrospect, you can always criticize things in retrospect and so on, but it had elements going for it, and it was very stable for a very long time. and South Africa developed, and it suited probably 95 or 99% of the population, but didn't suit 1%. And the 1%,
Yeah, always.
They drove the revolution.
Always.
I mean, you had about 10 blacks who, in the 1950s, you had about 10 black people with degrees, and they felt that this whole system, wasn't open to them, and therefore there had to be a revolution to place them in control. And in order for people like Nelson Mandela never really qualified properly as a lawyer, but for him to be a lawyer practicing in the downtown Johannesburg, there had to be a whole revolution, which didn't benefit 99% of the other blacks who are still, trying to get out of their sort of very basic
tribal ways,
existence.
really.
Yeah. If you're talking about the rural areas, they're trying to get out of this sort of late Iron Age tribal existence, living in mud huts and so on, into a more westernized lifestyle.
Yeah.
So much of this revolution hasn't benefited them at all. I mean, they were much better off in the previous system, which was more designed for them, where they had
even
and ironically, the core of the sort of tribal system that we had under apartheid has been kept by this revolutionary black government.
Yes.
I mean, that's the irony.
Yes,
they are still paying 700 black chiefs monthly salaries to do what they've been doing for hundreds and even thousands of years. And half of all the blacks in the country still live subject to tribal rule by tribal chiefs with their own legal system, where the chief decides, and they don't follow the Western rules at all.
Yeah.
So that is the irony. And all these liberal media overseas talking about democracy and all that, they won't tell you that.
No, and yet that was at the heart of the apartheid system.
Absolutely.
It was the heart of it. And they are still living it by choice, except the whites can't have their own area. That's the only red line.
Yes, exactly.
But
the rest, even, and there's this whole conflict. I was talking earlier on about the riots in Pretoria and the 20 buses being burnt and the shops being looted and all that.
Yes.
And all of that is actually a tribal conflict within the ruling party, because up to now, they've actually appointed, they followed the old apartheid system where, each ethnic group would be ruling that part of the country where their traditional area.
Yes.
But now, because of the sort of power that the Zulus now enjoy, having more or less taken over the ruling party and calling the shots because they are the biggest tribe, they imported a mayor of Pretoria from rural KwaZulu-Natal, this Toko Didiza, who's a previous minister, and they're going to make her the new mayor of Pretoria. She's now the candidate for the ruling party there. And the other ethnic groups who actually live in that area, which is not a traditionally Zulu area at all, like the Pedis and the Tswanas and so on, they are absolutely up in arms about that. I mean, and they've actually been rioting as a result of that. So they're not rioting against apartheid in a sense. They are rioting for apartheid. They want apartheid back. Yes. They don't want the Zulu women coming all the way from KwaZulu-Natal to come and rule them up here. They want their own ethnic group, their own ethnic leader in their area to rule over them, which is only natural. I mean, that's the way it works in Europe. The Germans rule the Germans and the French rule the French, etc., etc. But somehow people thought it was going to be different in South Africa. I don't know. I mean, there was so much muddled thinking about this system. It was a very simplistic solution, and it's not working for this country. I mean, they just imagined that there was one homogenous group of people living here that just differed here and there in skin color, and that's not half of it. I mean, that's the least. No. That's the least of it.
Well, that's the problem, Dan, and that is why I have done an entire series on the history of South Africa and another series I'm doing on historical figures of South Africa, black and white, because the world does not understand. They A, had no interest, and B, they were fed a bunch of lies about South Africa. So
yes,
in that way, I'm trying to educate
what
them.
Happened was that, I've only, the last 10 years or so, I've really tried to understand the American experience since the Second World War too, and the American racial problems and the civil rights and, all of the stuff that happened in the 1950s, and busing and desegregation. And,
yes.
And what happened in the South. And even though there are similarities, I think what happened was that people in the US, and especially the US liberals, they just extrapolated the US situation onto South Africa, and they imagined that it's the same, not realizing that these black people here, they are real Africans. They come out of an African tribal system. They speak their own African language. They've got their own customs, culture, and so on. That's not going to change ever.
No.
So they are very much different to American blacks who have been to some extent westernized, and who also speak English or a form of English, as a language. Whereas for most blacks here, English is still to some extent a foreign language.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they do speak it to some extent, but it's not their home language.
No.
So that makes it completely different.
And you cannot.
And they just imagine that, South Africa is now going to desegregate, and that's the end of the problem. No.
It's not when you've got more than...
It hasn't even worked in America,
no.
let alone here.
Where you have more than 11 tribes with all their own chiefs, their own kings, their own homelands, their own language, their own way of life, their own rules, their own... You cannot force segregation, desegregation. You cannot force people to integrate because they don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this now over the last few weeks in Pretoria. People rioted when this whole kind of, mixing things up, sort of making a cocktail, an ethnic cocktail of government. They rioted against that.
And burnt all.
So next time they'll be more careful about doing anything like that.
Do you think so, Dan? Do you think that they will learn from their mistakes, or do you think that they will feel that they're in such a position of power that they can continue to do it their way?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit pessimistic, or I don't know, but from what, I've read a lot about post-colonial history in Africa, and a lot of books about that. I've even translated one book from French that a French journalist wrote about mainly West Africa, but also other parts of Africa. And it seems to me that sooner or later, all of these African countries go through a huge crisis. I mean, that's almost a given. You had a place like the Ivory Coast that for 20, 30 years was seen as a model of democracy and development and so on. And then within a few months, it hit a wall and there was a succession problem. And then there was a civil war, just like that.
Yes.
So South Africa is not going to escape that. I think sooner or later, we're going to have that crisis, and it has to come. We're not going to be able to avoid it, no matter what. And we have to, in a sense, prepare for it. We've got to, be ready for it. And when it comes, we should see that then as an opportunity then to dictate our terms and to, get a more reasonable setup for ourselves out of that situation. And I think whatever crisis then happens, we should not take responsibility for that. The rest of the world and the people who created this, who dictated this to us, they will have to take responsibility for it, and it's going to cost them a lot of money. I mean, already Zimbabwe is probably costing the British and all the donors and people like that a lot of money, the whole catastrophe that Mugabe has caused there. But there was a British diplomat who actually happened to be, he was afterwards rewarded with a position, with the ambassadorship in Washington. They also gave him a title. He's now known as Baron Robin Rennick.
Yes.
And he is responsible, more than anyone else, for the mess in Southern Africa, in both Ex-Rhodesia and in South Africa. He played a major role, in handing over the Ex-Rhodesia to Mugabe, and also in getting the Communist Party and the ANC into power in South Africa. I mean, he even proudly stated that on a TV interview that I saw a year or two ago. So, Britain is responsible, Sweden is responsible. They financed all these revolutionary terrorist organizations, and they're going to have to pick up the tab. I mean, we have to just see to it that we survive and that we protect ourselves and that we stay safe and look after ourselves. But the mess that's going to come, they're going to have to foot the bill for that. Or otherwise, we'll just have you sort of a partly destroyed country with a starving population. And if they can't do anything about that, then I suppose we'll have to start, setting things right again. But then we'll do it on our terms. And, even if we have to go back to a sort of what they would call white supremacy or whatever other epithet they might come up with, we'll do what we have to do in order to, save our country.
Yes.
Which currently is being destroyed bit by bit.
And on that note, Dan, we've reached the end of the program. But for anybody who would like to follow events in South Africa from a very, very smart man's point of view, please do go to Dan's website, P for Peter, RAAG for golf.org, and follow Dan Roodt's writings. And you will find some fascinating stories about South Africa that you will not find anywhere else. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.